Hello, salvete, chairete. My name is Dr. Emily Jusino. I'm an assistant professor of classics at the University of Rochester. And today I'm going to be talking to you about the Parthenon, the life of an icon. So today we're going to look at the history of the building of the Parthenon, why it's such a remarkable building, why it's a complicated building, and what the life of this building has been. So to start off, I want to give a brief overview of Greek chronology. This is how historians divide Greek history into periods. And so here's a rough outline here. The time of the Parthenon built The time during which the Parthenon was built is the classical period, 480 to 323 BCE. This is generally the time when we think of like the high point of Greek civilization, comedy, tragedy, philosophy. All of those things are happening during the classical period. It's also worth mentioning that some of the things we're going to talk about today go back into the Archaic period, so the period before the classical period. And even a little bit, we're going to go all the way back into the Bronze Age. So the Bronze Age is generally associated with the Minoan and Mycenaean cultures. The Trojan War is legendarily supposed to have occurred during the late Bronze Age. And very briefly, the Bronze Age is a period of, seems fairly complex society and settlement. And then at the end of the Bronze Age, there's some sort of collapse where these societies collapse, and then we get something different that gets built back up during the Dark Age and Archaic period that leads to classical Greece as we know it. So that's just very briefly what's going on here with the periods. But I also want to point out the way we demarcate the Archaic period from the classical period is around the Persian Wars. So this is when the Persian Empire invades Greece and tries to take formal control over what we know of Greece, the Balkan Peninsula, and is eventually, after a series of invasions, repulsed by unified Greek forces in 480. So it's just worth pointing out that that's usually where we divide the Archaic period from the classical period, because that's going to become important in the history of the Parthenon. So with that, let's focus in on the Parthenon. So just to orient ourselves physically, we are in the Aegean, right? So this is the Balkan Peninsula where Greece is, Asia Minor where Turkey is, Athens is right here in an area of Greece known as Attica. And if we zoom in on Attica itself, here is Athens, centrally located. And in antiquity, in classical antiquity, Athens is really going to control this whole area of Attica. Is really part of Athens, and that's going to become important. And as we get into Athens itself, the city of Athens, the Acropolis, where the Parthenon is located, is situated right here within the city. And here we have the Acropolis as it looks today. And the Parthenon, of course, is the dominant monument on the Acropolis today. It gets used everywhere when we start talking about democracy or ancient Athens, right? The Parthenon is often the monument we go to represent antiquity, democracy, Athens. And so it's taken on this huge symbolic importance in contemporary society. But it's worth thinking about the history of this building. How does it get to become this icon? What is so special about this building? So let's talk for a second about the Acropolis itself. Now you can see in this picture, right, the Acropolis is a fairly steep hillside. It's very rocky. We can see fortification walls here. And the Acropolis seems to have started out in this way as a protected citadel when the first settlements, human settlements, developed in the area that is now Athens. And this is a reconstruction of what scholars think that the Acropolis would have looked like during the Bronze Age, so during that very old period of Greek history. It seems that there was a massive wall here, 8 meters high, in what's known as Cyclopean masonry, basically these very, very large, unfinished rocks, boulders even. And later people looked at these old walls from the Bronze Age and were like, oh, those stones are so big, the Cyclopses must have built them. And thus they get called Cyclopean masonry. It seems that there was some sort of palace here during the Bronze Age, which was pretty common in the Bronze Age to have palaces on the citadels. We don't have any archaeological remains of it, but they're pretty sure that one was there. And we actually do have remains on the modern Acropolis of the Bronze Age Cyclopean masonry. So it's this wall here. You can see just a little bit of it. And then here from the other side, right, you can see the really large boulders and stones that get put together. Here's some people down here for scale if you just want to get a sense of how big these things are. So that's what we know from the Bronze Age. And it becomes very common that these places that in the Bronze Age had been the earliest settlements do end up becoming religious sites, which is what's going to happen to the Acropolis. It's going to go from being this fortified settlement to the religious center of the city. Now, we don't have hardly any archaeological evidence from that period after the Bronze Age, through the Dark Age, and even through the early Archaic period. We don't have any evidence for temples or anything up here. But it's important to remember that in the context of Greek religion, the temple is not really what's important. What's important is the altar, and the altar is going to be outside of the temple. So to have a sanctuary, as we might call it in ancient Greece, you need an altar and you need the sacred boundary that demarcates what is sacred space and what is not sacred space. But you don't have to have a temple. So just because we don't have temples up here doesn't mean there isn't religious worship going on. And what we do find, though, from this period are little dedications like this, small bronzes, pottery, and things that seem to show some sort of religious activity happening. Now we'll point out that this is a bronze from Argos and not Athens, but this is typical of the kind of dedications that you see in this period. Now the earliest known temple on the Acropolis is sometime in the 7th century CE, roughly 650 BCE. And the evidence for this is a little problematic because it's literary evidence, and it's literary evidence from a couple centuries later from Thucydides. Now we have other temples being built that are attested archaeologically, but it's really difficult to figure out what's going on the Acropolis. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. The Acropolis it's kind of actually a mess. We really don't know what's going on up there in some ways. But we get a lot of construction in the 6th century, so roughly from 575 to 500 BCE. And this is also complemented by evidence of other religious buildings being built, festivals being started, dedications being made, and it just seems to be a lot going on. And what's kind of interesting is that this timing coincides with some interesting things happening in Athenian political history. There's a ruler known as Pisistratus. Often he gets called a tyrant, which were these autocratic rulers that were pretty common in the Greek world during the Archaic period, who has control of Athens during the 6th century. And he does a lot of religious projects. And we say the Pisistratids because after Pisistratus, his 2 sons take power. And so there's a few things that we know that he's responsible for, starting the temple of Zeus Olympiaeus in Athens, dedicating the altar of the 12 gods, which was the center of Athens in many ways. It was the point from which distances were measured, and it was an incredibly important shrine. He dedicated dedicated the altar of Apollo. He reorganized the Pan-Athenaic Games. So these were games that were celebrated every year that drew on all Athenians, Pan-Athenaic, right, all of Athens. So not just the city of Athens itself, but all that surrounding territory of Attica would participate. And in part of doing so, he developed the Panathenaic Way, which is the road that the procession for the Panathenaic traveled on. And he also reorganized the Agora, which was the central Athenian marketplace. But there's something important to mention about the Panathenaic Games as it relates to the Parthenon. That I mentioned there was this procession for the Panathenaic Games, and what the procession did was it brought a new robe to Athena. So the procession went all the way up onto the Acropolis, and every year select young women would weave a new robe for the statue of Athena. Now this is not the statue of Athena you've possibly seen. This was a very ancient statue. It was made of wood. It was called the Zoanon. And that's the most important cult statue on the Acropolis. And it's not in the Parthenon. It's in a different building. We don't quite know which building it was in, but that's a different story. But this is the big important part of this procession, and we want to keep this in mind because this is going to come up on the Parthenon. So that's kind of what's going on when the Acropolis is being developed. Now I mentioned that the demarcation between the classical period and the archaic period was the war with Persia. And it's kind of worth talking about that for a second, because that's also going to affect what the message of the Parthenon is. So, Persia in antiquity is a huge empire. This is the Persian Empire here, and it shows the periods of expansion of the Persian Empire. But it really stretches from Europe and North Africa all the way to India. It's an empire that does rely on expansion. And there's been interactions between Persians and Greeks for a long time. Persia controls, as you can see here, about the mid-6th century, Persia's going to control Asia Minor here, and there was all sorts of Greek city-states along the coast of Asia Minor. It's known as Ionia in Greek. And then Persia's going to make an incursion into Greece. It's going to attempt to invade Greece twice. Once in 490, and that seems targeted primarily at Athens and the island near Athens, Eretria. And it's actually, from the Persian perspective, payback for the Athenians helping some Greek city-states here in Asia Minor try to rebel against Persian control. And this is when the Battle of Marathon happens, and the Athenians and their neighbors, the Plataeans, manage to drive back the Persian invasion force, and that ends that invasion. The Persians more or less immediately plan on launching a much more substantive invasion of the Balkan Peninsula that is sidetracked when the king, Darius, dies a couple years after Marathon. His son Xerxes takes power, and then Egypt uses the change in power as an opportunity to revolt. Xerxes goes and deals with that. So it's 10 years before the Persians can mount this invasion of Greece, the second invasion. And this is a much more substantial invasion. This is when the Battle of Thermopylae happens, and then eventually the Persian forces are sort of stopped when Greek fleet led by the Athenians defeats them at the Battle of Salamis. And then the land force is finally pushed out the next year when a combined Greek forces defeat them at the land battle at Plataea. So this is all happening sort of 480, 479, this invasion. And one of the things that happens during this invasion is that the city of Athens itself gets sacked in 480 by the Persians. After the forces, after the loss at Thermopylae here, the Greeks pull back. A lot of them pull back to the Peloponnese. And most of the Greek city-states who are fighting back, they're the states in red on this map, are located in the Peloponnese. So their idea is we build a wall across the Peloponnese and try to stop the land forces there. Now, in the Peloponnese, right, the wall they want to build is here. You can see why this is a problem for Athens. So Athens withdraws its people from the city to this nearby island of Salamis, and the city of Athens is sacked. And it means that the temples on the Acropolis are burned and destroyed by the Persian army. When the Athenians get back to their city, one of the things they do, though, is what's left behind, they sort of religiously bury, right? Things that were religious were dedicated to the goddess. You can't just take them, but you can't also throw them out. So you have to sort of dispose of them in a proper way. And so a lot of this material that was buried survives. So we have this amazing collection of archaic artwork from the Athenian Acropolis, partly because it was sacked by the Persians. The only thing is, it doesn't actually help us figure out what was going on the Acropolis, because these structures were destroyed and then get built back over. So here are some of the archaic statuary that was found on the Acropolis, and this is all at the Acropolis Museum in Athens. It's a really stunning collection. What's also interesting is we have statuary from temples. We can tell it was part of a temple's pediment sculpture because of the shape. We don't know which temples they go to. Right, so this is what kind of the Acropolis looks like today, and there's some interesting things going on. So we know during the Persian invasion, they were building a temple on the site of the Parthenon. Sometimes it's called the Old Parthenon, and it was only about a third of the way built when Athens is sacked, so it's never finished. And then the Parthenon, as we know it, is built on an expanded version of those foundations. We have foundations here that are not rebuilt on, and then we've also got this very sacred area over here where the Erechtheion now is. And it's really not clear what's going on. So some people argue we've got names of 3 temples. We know there's a temple to Athena Polios, Athena of the city. There's a temple that gets called the Hecatompedon, which means the 100-footer. And then we know that the Old Parthenon is being built. So we know where the Old Parthenon was. We know that that's here. The question is, what are these foundations here? Is this the Hecatompedon? Is this the Temple of Athena Polios? So some people argue that these foundations here are the Temple of Athena Polios. The Hecatompedon was here where the Parthenon is, and then at some point that gets taken down, and then they start building the Old Parthenon there, and then that gets sacked, and then they build the Parthenon there. The other argument, the other way people see what's going on here, is that these old foundations are the temple that gets called the Hecatompedon, and that the shrine of Athena Polios is actually here under the Erechtheion. But we don't know, because nobody's going to tear up the Erechtheion to figure out what's going on underneath it, to see if there's any remains. And then there was nothing over here until the Old Parthenon gets built. But the argument for this is that the Erechtheion seems to cover some very, very ancient, important sacred areas. So there must have been something there before the Erechtheion gets built, because the Erechtheion gets built at the same time as the Parthenon. And it's a weird, weird building. And if I have time today, I will talk about why it's weird and what's going on there. It's just totally odd. And that the temple to Athena Polios is where, supposedly, this Zoanon should have been, and they would have rebuilt that temple given the importance of the Zoanon. So we don't really know, but these are the sort of competing theories. These old foundations stones are interesting. Here's a sort of aerial shot from earlier in the 20th century. And you can see really clearly that these are foundations of a building. You can see they sort of run up against what is now the Erechtheion. But you can walk by them today and not even realize that's what you're doing. So these kind of piles of stone that don't look that important are actually those old foundation stones. And all the tourists are sort of walking right by them, and everyone's looking at the Erechtheion because that's what's standing. But just so you know, if you ever have the chance to go to the Acropolis, that's what you're looking at there in that area that's roped off and you don't know why. Those are the old archaic foundation stones of this temple that we're not quite sure what it was. So, all right, so this is sort of the history of the Acropolis that gets us to building the Parthenon. The Parthenon is going to be built in the second half of the 5th century. And it's part of a building program instituted by the Athenian leader Pericles. The Periclean building program is going to be responsible for the Acropolis as we see it today. Most of the buildings up there are part of this building program. And this is a reconstruction of what it would have looked like when it was all done. We can see that it's brightly colored. And we can sort of see the buildings. The Parthenon obviously dominates the Acropolis here. Other buildings that are part of this building program are the Propylaea, which is the sort of formal entranceway. This little little temple here to Athena Nike, Athena of the Victory, and the Erechtheion, which is this weird little building over here. So after the Persian Wars, Athens and other Greek city-states joined together to form what's called the Delian League. And the goal of the Delian League was to protect against future possible Persian invasion. At least that's the ostensible goal when it is started. One of the things that happens almost immediately after the Persian Wars is the Greeks swear an oath, supposedly, not to rebuild any of the temples destroyed by the Persians, to let that be sort of a monument to the destruction wrought by the Persian invasion. Now, the Delian League is eventually going to become, for all intents and purposes, the Athenian Empire. Athens is primarily a naval power, and here we have an example of what the Athenian trireme would have looked like. These were the ships that comprised the Athenian Navy. There's a rebuilt one. Here, this picture is from a couple years ago. It is a commissioned ship in the Greek Navy today. It's called the Olympias. And on the left, here's a picture of what it looks like to row in one of these boats. Every so often they take it out and they recruit volunteers to sail it because they need a good number of people to row this boat. It's entirely powered, or primarily powered by human beings rowing it. It's a tight, cramped situation, but these are the boats that created an Athenian power for the 5th century. So, also very cool if you get the chance to go out and ever see it in Athens. It's totally worth the trip. Anyway, so very early on in the Delian League, the member states could contribute ships or they could contribute money. As time goes by and Athens takes greater control, that option becomes less available, and it gets to the point where the member city-states are primarily contributing money, and it's mostly Athenian boats that are out there, and this is one way Athens takes greater control, and more city-states are compelled to be part of the Delian League rather than voluntarily part of the league. And the real sort of significant change happens when there is a rising tensions with Persia, and there's fear that they might lose, and the treasury, so all the money for the Delian League, gets moved from the island of Delos to the city of Athens. So Athens really does take control of that money, and that money that comes in from the Delian League is partly going to help fund that building program on the Acropolis. Because the tribute that Athens brings in, a percentage of that tribute, a small percentage, but percentage nonetheless, goes to Athena as their patron goddess. And the funds for the Parthenon and that building program are partly going to come out of Athena's treasury. So Athena is paying for it, so to speak, but that money came in from tribute from these Athenian allies, imperial subjects, depending on how you want to think of them. So, Pericles, yes, decides to use money from the Delian League to rebuild the structures destroyed by the Persians, despite this vow that had been taken 30 years earlier not to rebuild. Now, granted, almost all the buildings that were destroyed were in and around Athens, so it's kind of a self-serving proposal that Pericles makes, and this is what's going to lead to the Acropolis as we know it. One of the things Pericles does is he takes column drums from this old Parthenon that was only sort of partially started and when it's destroyed, and he builds them into the fortification wall on the Acropolis. And you can still see them today. They're right there, and you can see them from the ancient Agora. So from the ancient heart of the city, you look up to the Acropolis and you would see these column drums that were a reminder of what your city had been through. And it's a really it's a very nice touch on his part, but it's a really sort of striking part of the wall even today. So what he's going to build on the Acropolis, we mentioned, right, is the Parthenon, the Erechtheion, the Propylaea, the Temple of Athena Nike. And we have a good sense of what this looked like because the famous travel writer of antiquity, Pausanias, of course, visits the Acropolis and writes about it. And even though he's several centuries later, he's writing in the 2nd century CE, he focuses primarily on archaic and classical monuments that survive on the Acropolis. So, the Parthenon. All right. So, it's built on the foundations of this old Parthenon that had been started, but it gets expanded. The name, it takes its name from Athena Parthenos, or Athena the Maiden. However, the name Parthenon itself is actually kind of weird. It doesn't totally make sense, grammatically speaking. In Greek, it seems to, it's basically a genitive plural, so something means something of the maidens, and there's wondering whether the term Parthenon only referred to part of the temple, and then eventually comes to mean the whole thing. We don't really know. The name is a little unusual. And this really, in some ways, could be thought of as a victory monument, right? A celebration of the victory over the Persians, right? By rebuilding this temple that had been destroyed. And at this point, arguably, there's been a peace between Greek city-states and Persia, and so tensions have finally settled down. We know the names of the architects, Ictinos and Callicrates. We also name the chief sculptor, Phidias, who was in charge of all the sculpture on this temple, of which there is a phenomenal amount. And Phidias was also responsible for the statue of Zeus, the Temple of Olympia, that was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And he was arguably one of the greatest sculptors in antiquity. Construction begins in 447, and the temple and the cult statue inside were dedicated in 438. So at that point, it's a functional temple. But the sculpture on the temple won't be complete until 432. And it was the pediment sculpture that was last to be finished. The Parthenon is made out of a very high-quality marble called Pentelic marble that comes from one of the mountains kind of ringing Attica. Now it's worth noting that Parthenon is a Doric temple, but it has some Ionic touches to it. So the Greeks developed 2 architectural orders, or schema or patterns for building temples, or well, building buildings, but specifically temples. And these originate during the Archaic period and kind of become as we know them sometime during the 6th century. The Doric temple tends to have a kind of stolid, sturdier look to it. Ionic tends to be leaner and more graceful. The 2 orders have different proportions and decorative details. In both orders, you'll get a pediment that is often sculpted. And In the Doric, you'll get a thicker column. It has no column base. It will be fluted. It means it's got the ridges in the column. And in the frieze, you'll get this triglyph and metope pattern. And that's one of the big markers to look for between Doric and Ionic. Metopes can be plain or they can be sculpted. And we've got a very kind of plain top to the column here. The Ionic order is going to have a narrower column. It's going to have these volutes, as they're called, these kind of scroll-looking things. And in the frieze, it's going to be blank. It's not going to have the triglyph metope pattern, but the frieze could be sculpted as well. But then, in case you'd have a continuous sort of frieze sculpture, it's not going to be broken up like a Doric column would. And sometimes you'll see these alongside the Corinthian column. The Corinthian is really very similar to the Ionic column in everything except for its column capital. The column capital, you can see the kind of volutes it has, but it has acanthus leaves on it, and that's really what marks the Corinthian order. One of the advantages of the Corinthian column is that its volutes actually come out on corners here, so it looks the same from all sides, unlike the Ionic where the volutes are flat. And the Corinthian column first appears that we know of in the 4th century, but it's never really that popular in the Greek world. It's the Romans who really love the Corinthian column and really just run with it. But there is a theory that the oldest Corinthian column actually appears on the Parthenon. So if we look at the basic floor plan of a Greek temple, we've got this outer column peristyle here. You have a front porch area called the pronaos. Then you have here the naos, or the cella, which is where the cult statue would be kept. This is the main room. And to kind of balance the front porch, you have this sort of back porch area called the opisthodomos. This does not lead into the cella. There's a set wall there, but it creates a nice balanced structure. So this is just the basic floor plan of a Greek temple. If we look at the Parthenon itself, it's kind of unusual. It's got the front porch here, but it's very, very shallow. It's got a really large opisthodomos, and some people have theorized that that's because that's where the treasury is being kept, and you need lots of space for that. We have Doric columns all the way around, and we can see here inside we've got a double Doric colonnade on the inside here. In the opisthodomos, we've got 4 columns. We do not have the tops to these columns, but the proportions on the columns seem to indicate that they are Ionic. So we've got a mixing of orders. And some people have even argued that these 4 columns are actually Corinthian columns, which would make this the oldest use of the Corinthian column. We don't know, we can't confirm one way or the other. However, one of the architects was probably the architect for what we know otherwise is the first building to use the Corinthian column. So it's not out of line, but it would be really unusual. But we do have some sort of mixing of orders in this temple. So it's a Doric temple with Ionic touches. And we'll talk more about what those Ionic touches are, because it's not just in the fact that we have what look like Ionic columns here, but it's also that temple's going to have triglyphs and metopes on the outside, as we expect for a Doric temple. But on the inside here, you can just sort of see in this picture, we have an Ionic frieze on the inner part of the building. So, kind of interesting. The other thing the Parthenon is known for is its optical refinements, right? And these are tricks in the building, tricks of the eye in the building. And this is a picture here of sort of an exaggerated version of what those optical refinements are. So things like the floor of the Parthenon is curved, so it's higher in the middle than it is on the sides. The columns on the corners are thicker than the columns in the middle. the columns actually slightly tilt inwards. The columns taper towards the top. The cultrum on the inside sort of tilts inward slightly. The entablature, so the pediments here, actually tilt outward a bit. And these optical refinements show up in other temples, but the Parthenon is sort of unusual in that it's making use of all of these optical refinements all at the same time. And you'll hear people say there are no straight lines on the Parthenon, and this is why. There's all this very subtle curving happening that we don't detect. Why? Well, there are practical reasons. So the curved floor helps water run off. So drainage is an issue. There's also the idea that these optical refinements help counter optical illusions that might make the building look like it's falling outwards or might make it look heavier than it is. Another argument is it makes the building look more dynamic. It kind of looks like it's sort of floating there because even though it's all made of stone, it's all marble, it doesn't sort of look weighed down by all of that. But it is one of the things that makes this building really unique, right? It's taking all of these optical refinements out there and using all of them on the same building. And this is kind of a theme for the Parthenon. It's a little extra if you want. If there's something to be done, it's doing it, and it's doing it all the way. The other area where this really comes out is in the sculpture on the Parthenon. So scholars have estimated that close to 90 different sculptors worked on this building based on chisel marks and studies of workmanship and things like that. And there is sculpture everywhere on this building. So the pediments are sculpted, the metopes, all 96 metopes are sculpted, and that's really unusual. So for example, the Temple of Zeus at Olympia, right? One of the 7 wonders of the world, the metopes are only sculpted on the front of the building. So there's only 12 sculpted metopes. The front and the back of the building, sorry, I should say. There's 12 on that. There are 96 on this. And then we also have this frieze, this ionic frieze, running all the way around the building. There's sculpture everywhere. And keep in mind, it took 15 years to complete all of this sculpture. Now, the metopes don't survive particularly well. And I think I misspoke. I said there were 96. There are 92 metopes. So late in antiquity, there's a fire that damages the roof of the building, and that makes the metopes more exposed to the elements. And then the northwest and east sides are defaced and destroyed pretty heavily when the Parthenon is converted to a church in the 6th or 7th century CE, and then even more are damaged when there is an explosion there during the Venetian siege of Athens in 1687, and then you have souvenir hunters showing up, taking things. So not a lot survives. The depictions on the metopes are, on the west we had the fight between the Greeks and the Amazons, of which 14 survived, but they're pretty heavily defaced. On the north, so the north is going to be this long side here. This long side here. On the north, we think it's the Trojan War. These are both damaged by the explosion and by being defaced. About 19 survive. The east side, the front side of the building here, seems to have been the fight between the gods and the giants again. And these were almost all totally destroyed when it was converted to a church. The best preserved side is the south side. These were, I think, difficult to get to, so they weren't defaced during the conversion to a church. But big chunks of the south side were destroyed by the explosion in 1687. But these are the best preserved metopes we have. And they do look really phenomenal. So here are a couple examples of surviving metopes from that south side. I always love the sort of composition elements of this one. And this is the battle between the Lapiths and the Centaurs. And all of these stories kind of have in common Greeks versus Amazons, Greeks versus Trojans, gods versus giants, humans versus centaurs, Lapiths versus centaurs, all have this idea of good versus bad, but like civilized versus uncivilized. And of course the Greeks, or the gods, right, represent the sort of civilizing good side. So there's a sort of message here in the metapes about what this temple represents, and it's not a far step to go from these fights to Greeks versus Persians, sort of the subtle subtext here, right? So we can sort of think of the Parthenon as this sort of victory monument. In the pediments, so the pediments, right, these sculpted triangular areas. On the east side, we have the birth of Athena. This is a reconstruction. The pediments were pretty heavily damaged. And on the west side, we have the contest between Athena and Poseidon for patronage of the city of Athens. This is a reconstruction on a reconstruction of the Parthenon in Nashville, Tennessee. Also worth visiting if you're ever in Nashville. It's very random, and you can see that they also have metapes here too, although it's sort of the same set of metapes all the way around. But nonetheless, it gives you at least some kind of sense of what these things might have looked like. It's an interesting building. And then the other bit of sculpture is this frieze. And the frieze is kind of interesting. It's runs around the entire building, so it's about 525 feet in length. Here it sits over the sort of porches on the east and the west sides, and then it runs along the wall here on the north and south sides. And if we look at the temple itself, right, it's right in here, and you can see it's actually would have been kind of difficult to see. So it's a lot of time and effort to put into something that would have been hard for most people to see. You'd have to get right up to the temple to be able to see it. And scholars have speculated that it might have even been an afterthought because it was sort of located in this unusual position. It marks a procession. It starts here at the southwest corner, and the procession kind of runs around both sides until it meets in the middle here on the east side, on the front side of the temple. And there's a lot of debate about what exactly is being depicted in this frieze. So very generally, right, it's a procession, there's a gathering of deities. It's really kind of cool the way it moves around the building, right, and it creates movement. And if you were walking up onto the Acropolis, you actually approach the Acropolis from the back. Right, the entrance to the Acropolis is actually at the back of the Parthenon. So to get to the front, you've got to walk all the way around this side and around to the front. So you get to kind of walk along with this procession. So the procession starts with riders kind of getting together on the west side. And these panels have been reconstructed in color to give you some sense of what the color on the building would have looked like. And there would have been metal pieces actually attached in. We can see where the attachments remain for the metal. And then as we go around on the north and the south side, we get the riders kind of coming together and they start processing. And you can see, as we look at these, you can see that each figure is a little different from the one next to it. So even though they're kind of generally the same, there's all these like very subtle touches to make them different, which of course makes the sculpting more complicated and speaks to the incredible time and effort that went into this. It's also worth pointing out that on the frieze, that the depth of the relief is no greater than about 6 centimeters. So just a couple inches of depth of relief, and you're getting, like 4 horsemen deep and stuff. It's just incredibly exceptional work that's going into these things. And this is part of what makes the Parthenon so remarkable, is the just unbelievable quality of workmanship that went into creating it. As we go down the long side, we'll get some chariots, we get elders gathering. We can tell they're elders because they're bearded, even though their physiques are somewhat idealized. We get people carrying things, various things here. We get musicians. This one's kind of neat because, again, the figures are all slightly different from one another, and you've got this guy here who's picking up the jug that he's about to carry. We get sacrificial animals. And then as we come around to the east, this is where we first get women showing up, and we can tell they're women by the way that they're dressed primarily. And we get some men here that look like they might be officials of some sort. And then in the center on the east side, we get heroes and gods. And the gods are the seated figures. And the way that we can tell that they're gods is because they're so much bigger than the people, right? They have to sit to fit in the frame. The people can stand. You can imagine if the gods stood up, they would sort of bust their heads right out of the top of the frieze. And this is sort of a continuous depiction of what the frieze here is. So this is the very center portion. We have gods who are sitting on either side of this group of 5 people. And the big question on the frieze is, what is going on here? We do not know what this depicts. The traditional explanation is that the frieze depicted the procession that brings the new peplos to the statue of Athena. We talked about that with the Pan-Athenaic procession. And so the idea is that this is that garment right here in the central scene. Zoom in on it. This is the new peplos. It's being brought to the goddess. But this would be a really unusual development in Greek temple decoration because it's usually mythological scenes that are depicted, not real people. And so that's one of the arguments against this traditional interpretation. At the same time, the Parthenon's doing a lot of unusual things and lots of new things, and so maybe they are innovating here as well. Another interpretation has been offered, and that's that this scene is depicting the Erechtheus myth. And in particular, it's depicting the lead up to the sacrifice of Erechtheus's daughter, who must be sacrificed to save the city. And so the idea is that this is Erechtheus and his wife Praxithea. This is the daughter who's going to be sacrificed. This is her funeral shroud. And what Erechtheus and Praxithea don't know is that their other 2 daughters, who are interpreted as the 2 figures, have agreed to die with their sister, and they are carrying their own funeral shrouds to join their sister. There are problems with this interpretation as well, right? It seems weirdly celebratory for something fairly awful that's about to happen. The gods seem very relaxed. It seems more celebratory and less funereal. So we don't know, and we'll probably never know what this scene is supposed to depict. But presumably it would have been obvious to an ancient Athenian audience what's going on here. And on some level, it's not really clear that it matters what this is depicting, because either interpretation both attempt to evoke a sense of piety, and particularly to highlight the piety of the city, and it also seems to tie the piety of Athens to this victory of order over chaos that we saw depicted in the Metapes, right? And we can take this to the Persian Wars, right? The victory over the Persians reflects well on Athens because Athens was pious to the gods rewarded Athens with victory. And so the piety of Athens is part of what makes Athens successful, and that's really part of the message of this whole building. The other piece of sculpture in the building, it's not stone, would have been the statue of Athena, the cult statue of Athena, Parthenos. This was a chryselephantine statue, so that means it was made of gold and ivory, and this would have been put over, the gold and ivory would have been laid over a wooden frame underneath. We have ideas of what it looked like from coins, from ancient copies of it. So in the middle here is a miniature copy of the statue. So like people go to Paris and buy mini Eiffel Towers. People would have had mini copies of this cult statue. The other two here are modern reconstructions. This one is in Nashville, at the Parthenon in Nashville. This one is in the library on my university's campus. Pliny tells us the original statue was 40 feet tall, and that in her hand she carried a statue of Nike that would have been about 6 feet tall. The decorations on Athena also tap into this idea of order and chaos. So her shield and her sandals depict fights between Greeks and Amazons, giants, centaurs, and then the base of the statue depicts the Pandora myth. And if we look here in the statue replica in Nashville, which is a full-scale replica, we've got a man standing in there just to give us some sense of proportion. It's huge. And I will say, just in case, the gold on the statue is real gold. The ivory, however, is not ivory because of course, modern restrictions on the use of ivory and elephant hunting. So instead, the ivory on the statue is a paint that is designed to mimic the luster and appearance of ivory. For a long time, this statue was just a concrete statue, and then, I'd say about 30 years ago, they actually sort of sought the funding to do the golden ivoryness on it. And it's, again, it's stunning and totally worth the visit if you ever have the chance. So that's what into creating the Parthenon, right? And it seems to stand as this victory monument over the Persians. It's a bit of a thumbing your nose at this sort of oath that the Greeks had taken decades earlier about the Persian Wars. It's a monument that was funded by the proceeds of empire. So it was built by a democracy, but it was built with the money that they took in from their imperial control over other Greek city-states. It's a temple, but it's kind of an unusual temple in that it's not the most sacred spot on the Acropolis. It's it almost seems like more of a treasury building than a temple in some ways. It's a really interesting, fascinating, and unusual building. And when you get into it, it becomes harder to figure out what does this building really represent. And it represents a lot of things, and it represents a lot of contradictory things. But it is a deeply symbolic building, nonetheless. And after antiquity, the Parthenon is going to continue to have resonance. So it's initially an Orthodox church, and then when Athens is conquered by the Venetians or taken over by the Venetians, it's converted from an Orthodox church into a Catholic church, both of them dedicated to Mary. So we went from Athena Parthenos to the Virgin Mary. When it's converted to converted to a church, this apse is built, which closes off both the east main entrance from the Greek temple and takes out part of the frieze here. Churches have their entrance on the west side. Ancient temples have their entrance on the east side. When it gets converted to a Catholic church, this bell tower is added. It'll then, when the Turks take over Athens, it gets converted to a mosque. And where the bell tower was becomes a minaret. So now we're looking at it from the north side here. And then the explosion in 1687 blows out much of the center of the building. However, even then, the Parthenon retains some attraction, because even in the remains of the Parthenon, another small mosque gets built inside the remains here. This is a reconstruction until, and this is what it looks like until the nation of Greece is founded in the 19th century. The Parthenon is going to sort of take one last sort of blow, if you will, when this man, Thomas Bruce, the Earl of Elgin, shows up, and he is the person responsible for removing a good chunk of the sculpture that survives the explosion and everything else. It is removed by him in the early 19th century. And there's a lot of controversy around the Parthenon marbles even today and where they belong. Elgin himself took them with the idea of decorating his estate in Scotland with them. However, he doesn't have the finances. He hits financial troubles and eventually sells them to the British government and to the British Museum, which is where they are today. He took about half of the surviving sculpture, and he didn't just remove the sculpture, he also, to remove it, basically committed structural damage to the building itself. So it wasn't like he was just picking up pieces that were lying around, he was ripping stuff off of the building. But yes, you can see all of what Elgin took is in the British Museum today. But the Parthenon itself in Greece is having a sort of interesting kind of resurgence now. They're doing some reconstruction work on it, which is controversial. But they're trying to use ancient techniques to rebuild parts of the Parthenon. There is a new Acropolis museum opened in the last 10 years that displays all the finds there. And on this top level of the museum, which is what you're looking at, it displays the sculpture from the Parthenon itself and displays it as it would have been seen on the building. So you walk around it. It has copies of the things that are found in the British Museum. You can see the copies pretty obvious here. And the really cool thing about this floor is that, as you can see here, it actually runs parallel to the Parthenon itself. So you can look at the statuary here and look up at the Parthenon and see it from right there, and it's really quite something. There is still sort of statuary up on the Parthenon, but it's all fake. The real stuff is in the museum, and then they put up replicas for things that were still up on the building when the Greek state sort of starts doing preservation work on this, on the Parthenon itself. So that's what I have for you today. That's what I'm going to call the history of the icon, how the Parthenon becomes the Parthenon. And it's a complicated building. It's a building in a location with a complicated history. It's a building that is deeply symbolic and holds this great resonance. It's a building that's tied into controversies that touch on issues that are still relevant today about who gets claim on this history. Should these things be repatriated? Who does the Parthenon belong to? Does it belong to the Greeks? Does it belong to the Athenians? Does it belong to the world? And these are big questions that tie into this building, that even from its inception is complicated and fraught and fascinating. And so I will leave you with that. Please let me know if you have any questions or would like me to expand on anything. Thank you so much for your time and attention.